I'm really delighted to be here and to talk to people about Father Willie Doyle, a person I first encountered about 12 years ago, and really when I read his life I was amazed at what I was reading. I thought, this is a man, a hero, who deserves to be better remembered. And if I was to give the elevator pitch of who this man was, I would say that he was a man who loved God and his neighbours so much that he was willing to be killed in order to save a soul or to save a life. And that, I suppose, is a basic summary of his life. But he didn't start out at that point. He had to grow and develop and grow in holiness and love of God to reach that point where he was willing to give that ultimate sacrifice of his life. So let's go back and look at the beginning and look at where he grew up and how he developed and grew over time spiritually and as a man with those human virtues that actually drove him and encouraged him to go out into the war and offer his life for others. So Willie Doyle was born in Dalkey in County Dublin on the 3rd of March 1873. He was the youngest of 7 children, and interestingly 4 of those children had religious vocations. His eldest brother had actually entered Jesuits for a short period of time. It was only a short while in the novitiate, and then he moved over to the Dublin diocese. And in fact, he died a week before his ordination. He was in Rome and he died of a fever, and that had a big impact on Father Willie, as we'll see later on. He was particularly close to the 6th child in his family, his brother Charlie Doyle, who plays a very important part in his story. So Willie's childhood was an ordinary childhood in many respects. He loved sports, he loved cricket, he loved sailing, he loved swimming, he loved tennis, and he loved playing soldiers, interestingly, and he always had that kind of military spirit within him. But one thing that marked him out as being very different as a child was his charity, his love for others, a very kind of precocious charity in a sense. His family were fairly well off. They had servants, and very unusually for a child of his age, Willie would get up in the morning and do some of the work for the servants. So even at a very early age, he had this care and love for others and serving others. He also looked after the poor in Dalkey. He would take his pocket money and buy food for them. He would take food from the house and bring to them. He would wash their houses, clean their houses, and sometimes even read books for people who were sick and in bed and in need of entertainment. One particular episode, though, as a child, speaks a lot about his character and the character of his family. And that is that at Christmas time, the local poor would come to the house and look for gifts. And they would get food and money. And what Willie and his brother Charlie did is they would take the coins that they were going to give to the poor and they would clean them. They shined up those coins to make them bright and look like they were new. Now, it's a hidden act of charity. In a utilitarian world, we might say, what was the point of that? But in a sense, it added love to the gift and gave extra dignity to that particular gift. And I think that says a lot about the man. In a sense, he was like St. Therese, who was born in that same year that he was born in 1873, putting love into little deeds. He had a lot of health problems as a younger man. He was big, he was strong, he was physically fit, but he had an unknown digestive complaint. That's all we know about it. Some type of internal constitutional sickness that he had. And he actually had this throughout his entire life, even when he was in the trenches in the war. And that doesn't really bear thinking about if you consider what that might have been like for him. So as I said, he was affected by the death of his older brother, and he had decided himself that he wanted to be a diocesan priest and enter the seminary for Dublin. And in fact, he had no interest in being a religious priest. He was once asked would he like to become a Jesuit or a religious priest, and no offense to our Jesuits here, but he said he would rather be shot than enter a religious order. But his brother Charlie gave him a booklet by St. Alphonsus Liguori, and that had a big impact upon his vocation, and he decided to enter the Jesuits, which he entered in Rahan at Tullabeg in the Diocese of Meath. That's where the novitiate was for the Jesuits at that time. And he spent 2 years in the novitiate, and obviously one's time as a novice in religious life is very important. It lays the foundation for much of the future spiritual life. And 2 very important things happened to him when he was a novice in the Diocese of Meath. The first thing is that the building he was in went on fire, and all of the novices were caught up in this fire. And it had a big impact on Willie, so much so that we're told that he had what's called a complete nervous breakdown. Now, we don't know exactly what that was. It may have been some type of post-traumatic stress disorder, some type of anxiety disorder. But it was so bad that he actually had to leave the novitiate for a period of time. And it was, I suppose, in some ways unusual that he ended up going back to the novitiate. I think if we look at this mental breakdown that he had at the age of 20 and consider what this man was doing 20 years later, where he was recognized by everyone who met him as a hero in the war, as a rock of strength, and as an ocean of peace and serenity, we see a tremendous transformation in his life, and we reflect on what it might have been that led to that transformation of his life. The other significant thing is that in 1893, near the end of his novitiate, he made a remarkable offering of his life, hoping to be a martyr. He wrote in his private diary, "Darling Mother Mary, in preparation for the glorious martyrdom which I feel assured you are going to obtain for me, on this the first day of your month, I solemnly commence my life of slow martyrdom by earnest hard work and constant self-denial. With my blood, I promise you to keep this resolution. Do you, sweet Mother, assist me and obtain for me the one favour I wish and long for, to die a Jesuit martyr." A remarkable thing for a young 20-year-old man to write. And in a sense, he lived that life of constant self-denial and slow martyrdom for the rest of his life. During the course of his studies to become a Jesuit, he spent some time in Clongowes and in Belvedere and had a very big impact in both of those Jesuit schools. He was instrumental in founding the Clongonian magazine and also the Clongowes Union, and therefore left a very important mark on that school. And he also spent some time in Belvedere down the road, and almost certainly, I'm sure, said Mass here in this church. We have some testimony from those who knew him when he was in the schools, when he was in Clongowes and Belvedere. One of his colleagues said, "His cheerfulness, his energy, his enthusiasm were infectious and inspiring. His whole conduct was marked by gentleness and a kindly thoughtfulness that gained him loyalty and affection. In the playing fields, he was a tower of strength. Above all, he gave the impression to us boys of one who lived much in the presence of God." And we're told that there were boys in the schools who decided to become Jesuits because of his example and because of the impact that he had upon them. If we move forward quickly through his life, he became a priest. He was ordained on the 28th of July 1907, and that's a very significant date for anyone connected with this church, because it's also the date on which our beloved Blessed John Sullivan was ordained. The two of them were ordained together on the same day. And writing in his private diary on that day, Father Willie wrote, "My loving Jesus, on this morning of my ordination to the priesthood, I wish to place in your sacred heart, in gratitude for all you have done for me, the resolution from this day forward to go straight for holiness. My earnest wish and firm resolve is to strive with might and main to become a saint." And it might be easy for somebody to write those words in their diary in the morning they become a priest when they're full of enthusiasm. But in fact, Willie Doyle lived that out for the remaining 10 years of his life. He only lived another 10 years after that. And every day he aimed to go straight for holiness, resolving again and again each day to try and become a saint. So after another year spent, what's called a tertian year, it's almost like another novitiate, where it's kind of a spiritual year, and he did another 33 days of spiritual exercises. He then had 8 or 9 more years of very intense apostolic work. He spent a year in Belvedere, and then he got his great wish, which was to be put on the Jesuit mission team. So for 7 years he spent really traveling around Ireland, every corner of Ireland, and a lot of parts of Britain, giving missions. And of course, missions were a very big thing at that time. You know, we didn't have Netflix or TV, so the mission was a big thing in a local town because of the religious spirit, but also a big event in its own right. He wasn't someone who just spent his time in the pulpit or in the confessional, although he spent many, many hours in the confessional, often past midnight. But he could be found going out to look for people and bring them back to the church, looking for people who are alienated from the church and alienated from God. He could be found at dawn on the streets looking to speak to workers, and he could be found at midnight in port towns looking to find sailors who are coming into port and to try and get them to the church, or even to hear their confessions in the port itself. We have a lot of testimony from people who knew him during those times when he was giving missions. Some of the testimony says, for instance, from priests who invited him into their parishes, "The results of your mission have exceeded my anticipations and all previous experiences. Indeed, the people speak of it with awe, as of a miraculous manifestation and a veritable outpouring of grace." And another one said, "There is a charisma of sanctity on Father Doyle that influences all who come in contact with him." In fact, there was one nun who asked him for a blessing, and she said afterwards that she had to go and kneel down in the chapel because that blessing had a bigger impact on her than all the retreats she'd ever done in 20 years as a nun. During this time of missionary work, Father Willie was engaged in many other apostolates and activities, and perhaps one of the ones that had the biggest impact, perhaps his biggest legacy, was in the promotion of vocations to the priesthood and to the religious life. He himself helped many, many people discern their vocations, and he also helped place women in convents, girls in convents, at a time when it was actually hard to get in because the convents in Ireland were so full. So he helped young Irish women find places in convents in the UK, in Australia, in South Africa, in America, and so forth. He wrote 2 best-selling pamphlets on vocations. One of them, called Vocations, within a few years of his death, had sold 160,000 copies. Another, called Shall I Be a Priest, had sold 80,000 copies. I once received a letter from a priest in England who had been a soldier in the Second World War. And this soldier's military chaplain gave him a copy of one of Father Willie's pamphlets on vocations. And reading the pamphlet, he decided he was going to become a priest. And some years later, he met the chaplain and he said, "I want to thank you for giving me that pamphlet by Father Willie Doyle. It's the reason I've become a priest." And the chaplain said to him, "You're at least the 12th soldier I know who became a priest from reading those pamphlets from Father Willie Doyle." And I myself have personally heard of 3 people in the last 12 months who found vocations through reading those booklets, one in Ireland, one in Scotland, and one in the US, even within the last 12 months. And undoubtedly, there are many, many others. There are some young people here in the church, and good to see you. So I'm going to give you a quote from Father Willie that you may want to reflect on. He says, "Boys and girls of Ireland, with your young lives so full of promise opening out before you, have you no nobler ideals, no loftier ambition than to spend your days in pleasure and amusement while your brothers and sisters look appealingly to you for help? This is the work that lies before you, the work God looks to you to do. Strengthening the faith that St. Patrick left us, preaching the truth to an unbelieving world, sacrificing yourselves for the sake of God and Ireland, giving your life that others may be saved." But it's true to say that Father Willie was not clerical in a bad way. While he promoted vocations, he also promoted the holiness of the laity. His other big passion in life was retreats for ordinary workers. At this point in our history, it was generally only priests and nuns who went on retreats, and for Father Willie that wasn't good enough. So he travelled throughout Europe studying retreats for lay people on the continent. And this was a huge novelty in Ireland at the time. He wrote a pamphlet about it, encouraging the setting up of retreat houses for lay people. And interestingly, what he wrote in that pamphlet was, "When God wants a work done, human difficulties are no obstacle." And Father Willie worked against the human difficulties that were opposed to him setting up that retreat house. His explicit aim in doing so was to foster lay apostles, to encourage these workers to go out and do apostolate with other workers. So in a sense, Father Willie was living that universal call to holiness 50 years before the Second Vatican Council. Finally, he was given a house in which he could organise these retreats for lay people, but for some reason, it was burnt down by the suffragettes. I'm not quite sure what was so significant about that house. But in fact, it was established after his death, so that's another part of his legacy. He didn't live to see it, unfortunately. Father Willie was involved in a huge number of other innovative apostolates. He gave spiritual direction by correspondence, sometimes getting more than a dozen letters per day from people seeking his help and his assistance. He translated books from French into English, particularly religious biographies about Jesuits. He wrote a book on the rubrics of the Mass, and he sketched out notes for a book about scruples, a book which is actually still very popular today. He was instrumental in founding the Poor Clare Convent in Cork City, so anyone from Cork, the Poor Clares owed their existence to some extent to Father Willie's work. He was actually the first priest to promote Eucharistic holy hours in Ireland, hard to believe. He was the head of an organisation called the League of Priestly Sanctity. This was a Jesuit apostolate that worked with priests to encourage them to live their vocation. He was on the Central Council of the Pioneers, and he was handpicked by Father James Cullen to be his successor, although he didn't live long enough to take on that role. And he raised a lot of money for the missions. So a very, very busy man. But then the First World War came, and he felt a call to go further. Now we might say, look, he was living a very busy and very successful life at that time, but he felt called to go out there, to go to the periphery, to be with these working men that he loved, and to be with them in their moment of danger. He could comfortably have stayed here, but he wanted to give more. And writing about his experience of volunteering, he says, "I have volunteered for the front as military chaplain, though perhaps I may never be sent. Naturally, I have little attraction for the hardship and suffering the life would mean, but it is a glorious chance of making the old body bear something for Christ's dear sake. This much my offering myself as chaplain has done for me. It has made me realize that my life may be very short and that I must do all I can for Jesus now." Sentiments perhaps that all of us can take on board. So Father Willie was a chaplain in the 16th Irish Division from November 1915 until August 1917. He had some short periods of leave back at home, but by and large he was with his men for that period of time. He had the rank of captain in the army, and as a captain he had certain privileges, and he generally did not avail of those privileges. One of the privileges, and it was a double-edged sword, was that he had an orderly or a servant to help him. And he had a lot to suffer from this orderly, who lacked a bit of common sense. And he writes in his letters home about how sometimes the orderly would make his tea out of, as he says, water that has washed the body of 100 dead German soldiers. Or sometimes he washed Willie's boots in water that came from a cesspool, so it doesn't really bear thinking about. What's interesting, of course, is that Father Willie volunteered to be a chaplain when he was in his 40s. He wasn't old in his 40s, but he's not a young man at that point either. So he's getting a bit older, but still he pushes himself to go out into an uncomfortable situation. Pope Francis says that priests should smell of the sheep, and I'm sure there were times in the trenches when Willie actually smelt like a sheep when he was out there. He was involved in some of the major battles of the war, the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Messines Ridge, the Battle of Ypres, and he won the Military Cross for his bravery in the Battle of the Somme. Now what's significant about Father Willie is how many letters he wrote home about his experiences in the war. And in fact, if you pick up any book about the Irish in the First World War, Father Willie is there. He is a very significant figure. He wrote certainly scores, if not hundreds, of letters home, over 200,000 words in those letters that he sent home, mainly to his father who he loved very dearly and who was worried about him. And so again and again we find in these letters home a tremendous love for his father, a tremendous cheerfulness, and a real desire to put his father at ease, his father who obviously was worried about him. And this, in a sense, is another sign of his virtue. He could have been resting. He was tired, he was worn out, he was facing danger. But again, he's writing these actually quite entertaining and cheerful letters home. His work as a chaplain involved hearing the confessions of soldiers, bringing the Blessed Sacrament to them, giving them the last rites, preparing them for battle, burying the dead, and he describes many times in his letters how he buried the dead under shell fire at great risk to his own life. He assisted prisoners, and he encouraged the fearful. And a significant part of Father Willie's ministry is that he was universal in his pastoral care. He didn't just care for the Catholic soldiers. He had a great love and was loved in turn by the Protestant soldiers from Northern Ireland. On one occasion he went to one of these who was wounded, and as he was tending to him, the soldier said, "Father, I don't belong to your flock." And Father Willie's response was, "No, but you belong to my God." He was also known for his care for German prisoners who had been captured, and he also often wrote home to their families to give some news to them and to reassure their families that they were being looked after. So in a sense, Father Willie was an icon of peace and reconciliation in the midst of a dark time of hatred and division. Now, trench life was not easy. Father Willie writes very eloquently about his friends, the pests who seem to follow him everywhere. He writes on one occasion, "We have rats and fleas by the million, innumerable flies which eat jam off your bread before you can get it into your mouth, smells wondrous and varied, not to speak of other unmentionable things." And there are many times when he describes being woken up as he's sleeping in his dugout, which is a little piece dug out of the side of a trench, woken up by rats crawling over him in the middle of the night. It doesn't really bear thinking about. And he writes on one occasion at Christmas 1916 about his tragic tale of the plum pudding. In early December, his sister-in-law sent him a Christmas pudding. And he writes, "As I write this letter to you, a huge plum pudding has just walked in the door. 100,000 welcomes. The Lord grant that I don't get killed until after Christmas at least. It would be a fearful disaster to leave that treasure behind." And so he wrapped up the pudding and he put it in the corner of the dugout. But lo and behold, a few weeks later, when he went to get it, he writes in a letter, "A villain of a rat worked his way into the middle of the pudding and built itself a home there. There was not much plum pudding left after that, but the remainder was all the sweeter." So such are the difficulties of life in the trenches that our normal notions of hygiene go out the window. The remarkable thing about Father Willie is, even surrounded by all of these dangers, as I said, he was always cheerful and always joyful. And his letters home have a lot of these humorous stories in them. For instance, on one occasion, he describes seeing a plaque in a church, and he says, written on the plaque were the words, "Erected by Monsieur X in honor of his dear wife Marie, who lived 79 years, 4 months, and 6 days. They were married 55 years, 9 months, 2 days, and 7 hours, R.I.P." And Willie's acerbic comment on that was, "There's nothing like being accurate, but possibly this unfortunate man wanted to record that he had so much of his purgatory already done." But Willie saw a lot of terrible things in his time at the war. He describes his experience at the Battle of the Somme in these words, "I've been through the most terrible experience of my whole life, in comparison with which all that I have witnessed or suffered since my arrival seems of little consequence. A time of such awful horror that I believe if the good God had not helped me powerfully by his grace, I could never have endured it. To sum up all in one word, for the past week I have been living literally in hell, amid sights and scenes and dangers enough to test the courage of the bravest. But through it all my confidence and trust in the blessed Lord's protection never wavered, for I felt that somehow, even if it needed a miracle, he would bring me safe through the furnace of tribulation. I was hit 3 times, on the last occasion by a piece of shell big enough to have taken off half my leg, but wonderful to relate, I did not receive a wound or a scratch. There is some advantage, you see, in having a good, thick skin." And on another occasion, he described a very moving mass that he said at the Battle of the Somme. He says, "By cutting a piece out of the side of the trench, I was just able to stand in front of my tiny altar, a biscuit box supported on 2 German bayonets. God's angels, no doubt, were hovering overhead, but so were the shells, hundreds of them, and I was a little afraid that when the earth shook with the crash of the guns, the chalice might be overturned. Round about me on every side was the biggest congregation I ever had, behind the altar, on either side and in front, row after row, sometimes crowding one upon the other, but all quiet and silent, as if they were straining their ears to catch every syllable of that tremendous act of sacrifice. But every man was dead. Some had lain there for a week and were foul and horrible to look at, with faces black and green. Others had only just fallen and seemed rather sleeping than dead. But there they lay, for none had time to bury them, brave fellows every one, friend and foe alike, while I held in my unworthy hands the God of battles, their creator and their judge, and prayed him to give rest to their souls. Surely that mass for the dead, in the midst of and surrounded by the dead, was an experience not easily to be forgotten." He describes on other occasions what it was like to go and help men who were wounded. He says on one occasion in a letter, "He opened his eyes as I knelt beside him. 'Ah, Father Doyle, he whispered faintly, and then motioned me to bend lower as if he had some message to give. As I did so, he put his 2 arms around my neck and kissed me. It was all the poor fellow could do to show his gratitude that he had not been left to die alone, and that he would have the consolation of receiving the last sacraments before he went to God. Sitting a little way off, I saw a hideous bleeding object, a man with his face smashed by a shell, with one, if not both eyes, torn out. He raised his hand as I spoke. "Is that the priest? Thank God, I am all right now." I took his blood-covered hands in mine as I searched his face for some whole spot on which to anoint him. I think I know better now why Pilate said, "Behold the man," when he showed our Lord to the people. There's one act of generosity I spoke about in his early days, which was shining the coins. There's another incredible act of generosity that he made near the end of his life. On one occasion, he was in the dugout with the doctor. The doctor was sick. He had some type of fever or flu. For some reason, they didn't have any sheets, any ground sheet to keep them dry, and they didn't have any blankets to keep them warm. And the doctor was shivering, and the two of them are lying on the cold, wet ground. Father Willie wasn't sick, and so he insisted that he himself would lie face down on the cold, wet ground, and that the doctor would lie on his back, so that the doctor would have somewhere a little warmer and a little drier to rest, so he could recuperate from his fever. That is, to my mind, an incredible act of generosity and selflessness to do this while he himself was undoubtedly suffering. So as we move towards the end of Father Willie's life, he was in the Battle of Passchendaele, the third Battle of Ypres, a battle in which there was terrible suffering and shelling and incredible casualties. And for some reason, another chaplain who was designated to help him didn't show up. So Father Willie was the only chaplain there with the men for 2 weeks, under constant shell fire, incredible danger, and incredible loss of life. And on the 16th of August 1917, soon after 3 p.m. in the afternoon, Father Willie saw 2 soldiers wounded, Lieutenant Charles Marlowe and Lieutenant Arthur Green. And Willie, as he did on many, many other occasions, left the relative safety of his trench and went out into no man's land to help these 2 wounded men. And all of them were hit by a shell and killed instantly. Father Willie's body was never recovered. In fact, his body was found. Some men made a note of where he was at the time. They removed some buttons from his uniform, and they removed the pioneer pin that he was wearing. And later on, they went back to take the body and to bury it, and it was gone, presumably hit by another shell. There was an incredible outpouring of grief after Father Willie's death, even in the mainstream media. In the Daily Express, a week after his death, it was written, "He went forward and back over the battlefield with bullets whining about him, seeking out the dying and kneeling in the mud beside him to give them absolution, walking with death with a smile on his face, watched by his men with reverence and a kind of awe until a shell burst near him and he was killed. His familiar figure was seen and welcomed by hundreds of Irishmen who lay in that bloody place. Each time he came back across the field, he was begged to remain in comparative safety. Smilingly, he shook his head and went again into the storm. He had been with his boys in the Somme, and he would not abandon them now. They remember him as a saint. They speak his name with tears." And as I said, Father Willie was greatly loved by the non-Catholics. One soldier, a Protestant soldier from Belfast, said, "God never made a nobler soul. If he risked his life to look after Ulster Protestant soldiers once, he did it 100 times in the last few days. Father Doyle was a fine Christian in every sense of the word. He never tried to get things easy. He was always sharing the risks of the men. Many a time I have seen him walk beside a stretcher trying to console a wounded man with bullets flying around him and shells bursting every few yards." And his superior, Major General Hickey, writing to his father, said, "I could not say too much about your son. He was loved and reverenced by us all. His gallantry, his self-sacrifice and devotion to duty were all so well known and recognized. I think his was the most wonderful character I have ever known." But that is only half the story, although be assured I'm well more than halfway through my talk. Back in his room in Rathfarnham Castle, the Jesuit residence that he had been based in, there was a box, or several boxes, written on it, a note saying, "To be destroyed in case I am killed." And his brother, Father Charlie Doyle, went and rescued that box and looked at it, and thankfully it was not destroyed because it contained Father Willie's private diaries and spiritual notes. And what they revealed was that Father Willie had lived a secret life of very intense prayer and very intense self-denial. In fact, he felt called to a hard life, a life that was offered up in reparation for the sins of priests. On one occasion he wrote, "I believe that our Lord is asking for victims who are willing to suffer much in reparation for sins, especially those of priests." And the very last thing he wrote in his diary, on the 10th anniversary of his ordination to the priesthood, and just about 2 weeks before he was killed, he wrote, "I have again offered myself to Jesus as his victim, to do with me absolutely as he pleases. I will try to take all that happens as sent to me by Jesus, and will bear suffering, heat, cold, etc. with joy, in reparation for the sins of priests. From this day on, I shall try to bravely bear all little pains in this spirit." So in the early 1920s, Alfred O'Reilly, a very famous man in his own right, published a lot of details from these diaries as part of a biography of Father Willie, and this book was a blockbuster. It was translated into multiple languages and went through multiple editions. And this led to an incredible outpouring of devotion to Father Willie after his death. By the early 1930s, the Irish Jesuits had received over 50,000 letters from all around the world testifying to devotion to Father Willie, and over 6,000 letters alleging healings through his intercession. Canonized saints have been devoted to him, including St. Teresa of Calcutta. So the question arises, he lived 100 years ago. Why would we remember him now? Why have a talk about him? Why publish books about him? Why speak about him and write about him? St. Paul VI said, "Modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers, and if he does listen to teachers, it is because they are witnesses." Speaking when he was appointed as Archbishop of Dublin, Archbishop Dermot Farrell said, "Saints are women and men who embody Christ in their words and actions. Saints are people who live Christ." We remember St. Kevin, St. Lawrence O'Toole, Catherine Macaulay, Matt Talbot, John Sullivan and Margaret Aylward, who were the gospel clothed, as it were, in a body. In a sense, we can say that Father Willie Doyle was a teacher and a witness, and he too, as it were, was the gospel incarnated or clothed in a body, walking the streets that we walk, certainly celebrating Mass in this chapel that we're in, this church that we're in here. And so remembering him and telling his story is itself an act of evangelization. Over the last 100 years, many people have prayed and hoped that his cause could be opened. And that is a question for the church and its wisdom to consider in its own good time. But I would say that there are three aspects of Father Willie's life that make him a very relevant figure for us today, perhaps more relevant today than he was even 100 years ago. The first, a forgotten fact of his life, is that Charles Marlowe and Arthur Green were not Catholic soldiers. They were Anglican soldiers from Northern Ireland, marking Father Willie out as an ecumenical martyr of charity, a figure of unity and reconciliation in these islands. The second is the fact that he offered his life in reparation for the sins of priests, something that has a greater resonance and relevance for us now than it ever could have had 100 years ago. And the third, if you remember the start of the story, was the breakdown that he had as a novice. And 20 years later, we see what he was able to do. His life is one of incredible transformation, incredible healing, and in that sense, he is a sign of hope and a potential intercessor for the many people in our community today who suffer from anxiety and stress. And so, in the coming weeks, a new organization will be launched called the Father Willie Doyle Association. And this is an organization, an apostolate, that will seek to preserve Father Willie's memory and to share his story and to encourage and to spread his message as a sign of peace, hope, and encouragement for all of us who struggle to be better Christians. There are a lot of aspects of Father Willie's interior life and spiritual life that I didn't have time to get into today. And there's so much that we can unpack and learn from him as we ourselves struggle to be better Christians. If you want to find out more about the Father Willie Doyle Association, I encourage you to go to fatherdoyle.com. That website is going to change soon into a new website. But there's a form there. You can fill out that form this evening, or fill it out on your mobile when you leave the church. Don't get distracted with your phone now. If you want to be kept informed of future activities that we will be engaging in. I also want to point out that there is a book for sale at the back of the church called To Raise the Fallen, which contains some of Father Willie Doyle's letters from the war, a brief biography of him, and many of his prayers and spiritual advice. And we're also joined by EWTN today, who have available at the back of the church their DVD called Bravery Under Fire, which is a remarkable docudrama on Father Willie's life, with many reenactments from his time in the war. Very, very moving docudrama. So if you want to know more about Father Willie, I encourage you at the end to go down and get those 2 items. So that's enough. I've spoken for long enough. I want to thank you for your attention, and if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to take them.